All right, Facebook, here we are again. I want to talk a little bit about this idea of affinity bias. So, I want to spend some time talking today a little bit about this idea of affinity bias. So, when we first think about this idea or the conversation around affinity and then bias, we know that affinity means like me, right? So, something that I prefer or is geared towards my expectations, right? So, affinity, things I have positive regard for, inclinations to entertain, things that are ultimately like me. And then bias, obviously, we've talked about bias before. You have an idea what bias is. It's that kind of the way of thinking that comes out of or is developed out of a particular kind of context, right? So you've grown up in a certain kind of neighborhood, you know certain kinds of folks, you interact with people in a particular kind of way because of the context that you're in. So affinity, like me, bias, meaning, I have a strong leaning towards this one thing or the other thing. So when we talk about this idea of in-group and out-group affinity bias, as well as double standards, it becomes important to recognize how all of those things play in. So please raise your hand, and I'm sure many of you can think of a time or a place where you were a part of the in group, the in crowd, the popular group, right? So in K-12 education, it typically is kind of like athletes or kids who are academically high achievers might be in that in group. And then there are rankings within those kind of in groups, right? So football, oftentimes, depending on where you grew up, I grew up in Ohio, rates higher than basketball, just because of the gridiron and the toughness of the sport. So football players are seen in a higher or different light than basketball players, oftentimes, right? So there are these hierarchies in these so-called in groups, and many of us can also recognize if we use that same kind